Today's program has been brought to you through the generosity by Dan and Scott's Cremation and Funeral Service, 445 Waterville Road, Skowhegan, and by KSW, Federal Credit Union, 222 College Avenue, Waterville. Hello and welcome to another edition of Kennebec Valley Forum. Today we're visiting with Mr. Ron Chase, author extraordinaire, main author at that. Was originally from Gardner and now lives in Topsham. Ron, how did you start out on the road to writing?
Well, I never thought I'd be an author. When I was in the Army back in the late 60s, I did some report writing and I enjoyed that. And then I had a career with the IRS. And during that career, I did a lot of report writing. And I realized that I enjoyed the process. And I used to embellish my IRS reports. Sometimes they weren't all that popular, my embellishments. But when I retired in 2004, I decided that I was going to try my hand at being a freelance writer. And initially I wrote an outdoor column for the Lewiston Sun Journal for 2 years, and I also wrote outdoor stories for several other newspapers and magazines, and then I was fortunate enough to get a contract with the Manassas Ridge Press in 2008 to write a mountain guidebook, Mountains for Mortals in New England. And so that's sort of the evolution of the process.
Oh, wow. But you've, this is your second book today.
That's
that
correct.
We're talking about, the Great Mars Hill bank robbery. And
Right.
It does have a lot of facts. In my opinion, it's sort of is a double-edged sword. It talks about the plight of the Vietnam veteran to some extent, and it also shed some humor on the Vietnam veteran as well. Why did you pick this subject?
Well, it was a story that I first became aware of through a series of Bangor Daily News articles that were published in the fall of 1973, which was almost exactly 2 years after the robbery. And they were the result of interviews with Bernard while he was in federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. And while I didn't condone his robbing the bank, the story of a former Vietnam War hero turned improbable bank robber was one that captured my imagination. And I retold the story. I'm a little bit of a storyteller anyways, and I retold the story over the years to people. And after I wrote my guidebook, I was looking at options for another book.
Yeah.
And I ran into I was doing some mountain climbing in January of 2013 in New Hampshire, and I ran into a fellow who knew Bernard.
Oh, really?
And we had a long conversation, and I told him I'm going to try to write a book about this. And so I went home and I researched the Bangor Daily News archives, which are online.
Yeah.
And I put together an abbreviated book proposal, and I wanted to see if I could find a local publisher, so I emailed my proposal to Down East Books, which is an iconic Maine publisher. And that same day, their managing editor responded and said, "We're interested in this story." So
great.
that's how it all came about.
Wow, it's interesting. The time frame is about 1971.
That's right.
When this all took place, and maybe you can shed a little light on the character. We know he was a very decorated Vietnam vet, and maybe you can shed a little light on his past.
Bernard is an extremely interesting character. It was a real enjoyable process to research the book and find out about him. He was extremely intelligent, although he only had a 9th grade education, and he was almost fearless. He had a really tough childhood, a variety, very poor, and the family got broken up as a result of a fire and poverty. And when he went into the Army, he initially was a tunnel rat, which is probably the most hazardous duty in Vietnam, and then later he was a reconnaissance tracker who went into the jungle with just his dog in search of the enemy. So he had very hazardous duty. He had 3 tours in Vietnam, and he was heavily decorated, about a dozen medals for valor. When he returned home, people did notice a difference. And in fact, the military declined a 4th tour of duty, even though he was a very valuable soldier, and I think they were concerned about his mental stability. And I think in retrospect, I think we can safely say he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder.
That was before it was popular.
That's right. And at any rate, he had made a lot of money in the military because he not only was he a warrior, but he was also involved in the black market in Vietnam. He was very bright, and he exchanged currencies and made quite a bit of money. And so after he left the Army and he came home, he was home for a while, he got desperate for money. He didn't have full-time work. He had a romantic relationship, and then he started doing things wrong in order to acquire money, which ultimately led to his robbing the bank.
Yeah, I think it's a sad epitaph in the history of the Veterans Administration. Back in those days, the VA wasn't doing much for post-traumatic stress disorder, and did they understand a lot of it either. And I think, they didn't look after the veterans. We've
Right.
come a long ways with the VA, and I think, like I said earlier, it's kind of a double-edged sword. He was a warrior that went to war, very decorated. When he came out, was isolated.
Right.
And didn't have the capabilities he would have had today with the Veterans Administration. They've come a long ways. He probably wouldn't have robbed the bank today if that
Perhaps
was
not.
true. Yeah.
Right.
But having said that, the mental status of him certainly left him vulnerable to his demands and needs.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've learned in this process, and when I first decided to write the book, the attraction was the madcap escapades and the adventures and the fact that he was a war hero. But one of the things that I started to realize was that the importance of his military experience and how that affected his life. And I changed my perception of how I should write the book and what,
Really?
What it was about. And it was because of the research that I did. And I felt that it was important to talk about the various things that transpired in his life because they were exciting and interesting, intriguing. But I think it was also important to discuss his military experience and his childhood and how that all played out.
Sure.
And so after I did the research, my focus became sort of a two-phase focus, where part of it was telling the story as it happened, and at the same time relating, in my mind at least, why he did some of the things that he did, and what motivated him, and hopefully
the war certainly changed what motivated him.
Oh, there's no doubt about it, and I quoted some people in the book. One fellow who was a little blunt, but he said he went into the military normal and he came back crazy as a loon. Bernard was a very bright guy, and he was never crazy as a loon, but he was naturally a reckless personality. He was a type T personality, a thrill seeker by nature.
Yep.
And one of the areas that I learned a little bit about was what in the world of psychology they call traumatic reenactment. And some people who were exposed to a lot of traumatic experiences, and he was undoubtedly one of those with his military experience, when they do things later in life, they tend to do them relating back to the trauma that they had, and they do extreme things.
Yes.
And I think that was a big part of what was playing out with Bernard, because he seemed to do, after the military, he seemed to do everything in the extreme, including robbing a bank.
Mm-hmm. I guess there's a moral in there of some essence. don't rob a bank when somebody in there knows who you are.
Well, that's probably one of the lessons in the story. There's actually quite a few. The interesting part, I think there's several intriguing subplots to this story. One of them is how the FBI handled the investigation.
Yep.
Because when he went into the bank, he was clownishly dressed. He had a wig and giant dark glasses, and he was wearing his potato picking bandana, which was blue, and he had a long trench coat on. And the senior teller, a lady named Ola Rosser, who is deceased now, she immediately thought she recognized him.
Yeah.
And after the robbery, when the first law enforcement officer showed up, was a fellow named Fay Fitzherbert, who was acting police chief. She told him right away, she says, "I think it was Bernard Patterson." Well, the next day, the FBI came in because they investigate bank robberies.
Sure.
And they apparently, for an extended period of time, ignored her perception of what had transpired and who it was. And
Wow.
it actually gave Bernard time to, he hid out on Mars Hill Mountain for about a week in the snow. And then he came back into town and arranged to get transported to Connecticut. And he probably was able to do that because the FBI was slow in coming to the realization that Bernard was probably the bank robber.
Right.
And yet all the time they had the senior teller telling anyone who would listen to her that she thought it was Bernard. And the other interesting aspect of the FBI investigation is, according to Fay Fitzherbert, who is now in his 90s, but he has an excellent memory of what transpired. He was never interviewed by the FBI, and he was the first law enforcement officer on the scene. So,
Wow.
I think some of the what I would call inept decisions that they made contributed to his ability to escape.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Mars Hill is a very small community,
That's right.
and everybody knows everybody. And I found it strange that they would not accept that. You know, it's just
Right.
that he could walk into a bank, local person in a small community like that, and just somebody's got to recognize him.
Well, she wasn't sure, but she was quite certain.
Yeah.
She knew who he was. Yeah.
And she really did.
Right.
Well, the book we're talking about today is A Great Mars Hill Bank Robbery. And it's a classic. Maine author, Ron Chase, had written. And it's really truly a classic. There's some humor in it. There's some of everything I find in there that you did that. It was an arduous task to do all the research and to get all the facts that you could to write it.
Yeah, I spent, on a part-time basis, I spent about a year researching the book. I interviewed about 40 people.
Yeah.
And I researched the Bangor Daily News archives and the Presque Isle Star Herald archives. And I also researched a lot of public records and court records.
Yeah.
But it was a labor of love. It was a very enjoyable process.
Sounds like it. Just reading the book, I got that from it.
But I did put a lot of research into it, and part of it was that I wanted to relate the story as accurately and truthfully as I could.
Yeah.
It is a true story, and I'm one of these people, when I watch a movie that's based on a true story or read a book that's based on a true story, I want it to be true to the facts.
Right.
And to the best of my ability, it is, and it's because I researched it in that context.
A fascinating way of your writing style that's very good.
Thank you.
It flows very nicely. And I think it portrays somebody that really speaks of the times and the era, coming back from the Vietnam War. The 70s were really a key with the Vietnam War, and a lot of people had problems. And to be able to find that this gentleman, for lack of a better term for him, spent some time in prison,
Yeah, yes, he did.
And I think it was something like 16 years.
He was sentenced to 16 years. He actually served, and it's a little bit unclear, but somewhere between 6 and 7 before he was paroled.
Yeah,
The part of the attraction of the story for me was that I could relate to Vernon in a lot of ways. We were born just a few months apart.
yeah,
Back in 1947, we both grew up in rural Maine in relatively poor families, and neither one of us adapted well to school. I survived and graduated and went on to college, but it was not an easy process for me. I had a lot of energy, and school was a structured environment, and he dealt with some of the same issues. And then we both ended up in the Army in the mid-1960s, and we were both Vietnam-era veterans. I did not go to Vietnam. I went to Korea and Alaska, but so when I read the newspaper articles about him in 1973, I immediately related to him in a lot of ways because of the age proximity
yeah.
and everything.
That's interesting. I find that, and no wonder that you do such a good job writing the book, and because you had that.
And I had a lot of good friends who went to Vietnam, and in fact, the book is dedicated to the memory of a good friend of mine, Guy Bean, who was killed in action in Vietnam while I was in Korea.
Yeah.
And so I related in a lot of ways to Bernard's experience and to Bernard, and so I think that made the whole story a little more attractive for me.
Yeah, it's well done. There's no question. His travels. He did escape for a while.
He miraculously escaped, and initially his escape vehicle was an inflatable kayak, and then he flipped in the water in the dark in the ice cold waters of November.
Yeah.
At Mars Hill, and then he hid out on the mountain and Mars Hill for a week, and then he was able to by hook or crook find his way to Southern California. He purchased a fraudulent passport and found a Vietnam War buddy, and they flew to Switzerland with suitcases full of small denomination cash, and he traveled around. His friend was going to law school and went back home, but he traveled around Europe and lived the high life in the extreme. The amount of money that he had, he took with him a little under $100,000 to Europe. That would be the equivalent of about $900,000 by today's money,
Wow.
American currency.
Yeah.
And back then, the exchange rate was about 4 marks to $1,
Yeah.
or 5 francs to $1. So he literally was playing with, by today's standards, a few $1 million.
Yes.
And he spent almost all of it.
Yeah.
And he spent it. There was a little bit of Robin Hood in him. He did help people that he thought were in need, but he was very generous to himself too. And he bought very expensive clothes. He stayed in the most luxurious lodging.
Yeah.
And he ate at the best restaurants, and he collected fine wines, and he collected a lot of girlfriends along the way, and he just lived the high life for 7 months until he was caught. And he managed, through luck and brazenness and intelligence, to stay one step ahead of law enforcement for 7 months.
Yeah.
So it was.
How did they? Well, I won't divulge the book, but it's a very interesting book, and I would encourage people to delve into it because it is a tremendous story of one man's life, his trials and tribulations of growing up and going through the Vietnam process and
Right.
coming back and having to live with that. Should he have spent time in prison? He did the crime. But it's a question in my mind, if he was under the VA administration today, he probably would have got that VA loan.
He probably would have. I think that the treatment that soldiers get now is vastly superior to what it was
yes.
45 years ago.
Yeah.
They very well may have helped him through the process. He may have found some opportunities where he wasn't so desperate for money. He may have found a means of treating what I believe was almost certainly PTSD, as it was what he really did, and he self-medicated for the remainder of his life on marijuana.
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically how he in my opinion, my unprofessional opinion, but I believe that that's how he dealt with PTSD.
Yeah.
He
I
smoked
think you're
marijuana.
absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very interesting.
But I would say that if people want to read about one of the most colorful and controversial main figures of the last half century, then they should consider reading this book.
Oh, that's absolutely right. To take a very decorated hero of Maine and the trials and tribulations of what they went through with being a tunnel rat, that's not an easy thing to put your life on the line and doing reconnaissance with just a dog out there in Vietnam. A lot of people don't understand that, but it is. If he wasn't crazy when he was doing it, then he probably should have been when he came out, because that's tough duty.
Yeah, as I said earlier, he did have a reckless personality. There's no question about that. I'm a whitewater paddler, and I won't consider myself an extreme whitewater paddler, but I know a little bit about that personality, and I know some people who are, and there's just some aspects to some people's personality where they're going to do something that's a little more dangerous than what the average person would do. In Bernard's case, he did things that were a lot more dangerous than the average person would do, and I think that was in part who he was, but that kind of behavior can be channeled in a more positive way, and I think if he'd had the right kind of treatment, that might have worked out for him.
Yeah, absolutely right. Like I say, it's a wonderful book. It's got some humor in it, and it's kind of sad from my point of view, looking at it as a veteran that he didn't get the help that he needed and stuff, but it is what it is, and he did the bank robbery, did some time, and when he got out, he resorted to his medical marijuana.
That's right, and now it's legal.
That's right.
But one of another interest, there's several, like I said, there's several subplots to the story that are very interesting. One of them is that when he was extradited back to the United States and he was under the control of the federal court system, he was appointed a lawyer, a fellow named Paul Zenzian, who's deceased, who I knew through my career in the IRS. And the presiding judge was federal judge Janu, who was a famous federal judge, and someone else that I knew through my IRS career. And he was he was a World War II veteran, and he was quite sympathetic towards Bernard. And the book relates some of the conversations during the court hearings, because initially Bernard, even though he'd confessed to Scotland Yard, he was going to plead not guilty, and there were a lot of discussions about what he should do and how he should plead. And when he finally agreed to plead guilty, then they had a fairly long discussion about how he had served his country well and, in fact, saved the lives of fellow soldiers, and that should be factored into the sentencing process. And it was, and Judge Janu stated in court that he felt that was a factor in sentencing him, and that he believed that he was someone who could be rehabilitated, and he gave what was kind of an extraordinary directive to the parole board that at any point in time that they determined that he was rehabilitated, they should release him. And I think that more than anything else was the reason that he was released to a halfway house at about 6.5 years.
Yes, so that's very interesting, because he didn't even serve half the sentence
That's right.
of what he was sentenced for.
And he could have sentenced him to 30 years because not only did he rob a bank, but he had a weapon. And so if he could have been sentenced to a 15-year sentence for each one, it could have been consecutive
Yeah.
rather than concurrent, and he could have ended up with a 30-year sentence, and he ended up serving 6.5 years. So, I mean, 6.5 years is a long time in prison for someone with my perspective, but it's a lot better than 30.
Yes.
Which would have been basically his entire adult life.
And with his survival skills, I'm sure he did all right.
He did. He had a hard time. He told friends that after he got out of prison, that he was more afraid in prison than he ever was in Vietnam. And,
Yeah.
So because he didn't have his M16, he didn't have his
No.
bayonet, he didn't have his 38.
No.
He was a small guy, and so he felt very vulnerable in the prison
Yeah.
system.
Yeah, I can understand that. It's a terrible thing for anybody to go to prison.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody should even want to go, but some do.
Yeah.
Is there anything on the book that you find that you'd like to discuss that we haven't, Ron?
Well, there's some unresolved, what I call unresolved mysteries surrounding the
Okay.
book. And perhaps the one that I think is the most relevant is right before the robbery, someone called the Mars Hill Fire Department. And the Mars Hill Fire Department was not staffed. It had part-time employees and volunteers. And so the phone, when there's no one there, the phone would roll over to the Heuristic Health Center. And so a nurse, Elva Garrison, answered the phone. And she told reporters later that she believed that there was a young woman calling, and that she thought she heard a man's voice in the background. And they had a short conversation, and the young woman apparently was confused because she got the health center, so she hung up. Moments later, she called, and there was another call received by a different nurse, and this time she also thought a young woman was calling. And the young woman said that there was a fire on ACI Street in the other part of Mars Hill. And then she hung up. Well, that was about 5 minutes before the robbery took place. And following the protocol that was for announcing a fire, the nurse notified the fire chief, and the fire alarms went off. And I think probably if you lived in Maine back in the 60s, you know that the fire alarms would be very loud, and they could be heard all over the community. And so the fire alarms were blaring, and the fire department, the members of the fire department rushed down. They got in the fire truck, and back in those days, a lot of times the citizens from the fire alarms, they knew where the fire was, and a whole bunch of citizens showed up in cars, and they all followed the fire truck down Main Street. And at that time, the acting police chief, Fay Fitzherbert, was sitting in his car, and one of his responsibilities was, if there was a fire, was traffic control. So he followed the entourage as they raced down Main Street with their sirens screaming and the fire alarms blaring at the time that Bernard went into the bank.
Yeah.
And so initially, everyone associated with the robbery thought that there was an accomplice, a young woman. And to my knowledge, no one has ever identified who that young woman was.
Wow.
And later, after Bernard was captured and he was extradited back to the United States, a Bangor Daily News reporter questioned the U.S. attorney, who was Peter Mills at the time. And Mr. Mills said that sometime during, it was a rather vague response, but sometime during the investigation, the FBI had concluded that the caller was a telephone operator. and whose name was never divulged. And not only do I, but a number of people that I interviewed do not buy that story. It's
Why
very
would that
difficult to
happen?
believe that a telephone operator would call in and never identify herself and announce a fire.
Right.
And so I tend to believe that there was an accomplice before the robbery. And I think a number of people that I interviewed feel the same way.
I would think that tends to make sense because operators are trained to give the details, facts, and
Exactly.
And they would
yeah,
know.
They would identify them almost immediately. This is so-and-so from the telephone
Yeah.
company, and I've had a call about a fire, and
Yep.
and that didn't happen.
No.
So, very-
especially a small community like that,
yeah,
where everybody
exactly.
knows everybody,
Yeah.
you know, they know the operator,
Yeah, it doesn't ring true. I don't think that, interestingly, I had a retired FBI agent who attended one of the book events that I did. In fact, it was in Hollowell, and he came in and introduced himself before I did my presentation. And we had an interesting conversation. His memory of the facts don't reconcile with what I determined, but he's just thinking back 45 years, whereas I just finished researching all of this.
Yeah.
But he did say that, he said, I was drafted from the Boston office to go up to Mars Hill. He said we stayed in this flea bag motel, and the television only had one channel. It didn't come in well, and there was no bar in town. It was a dry community, and it sort of confirmed to me something that I suspected in doing my research, was that the FBI agents really didn't want to go all the way up there and investigate the robbery, and they couldn't wait to get out of town.
Yeah, that sounds like it.
And I really wonder if once Bernard was captured, if the issue of whether or not there was an accomplice wasn't very important, and it was never followed up on. I really
Sounds pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
Because, you know, they got the person and that didn't want to come up to Maine to do any more
Yeah,
research,
exactly. Yeah.
especially Mars Hill. That's a fair piece from here.
Yeah, they left, I think they were there about 2 weeks, and then they were gone. And to my knowledge, they may have gone up there for a couple of things, but I think pretty much from that point on, any law enforcement that went up were U.S. Marshals out of Bangor, and I don't think the FBI went back.
No,
There was a fellow, and I don't think he'd mind my mentioning his name, I use it in the book, a fellow named Brian Blanchard, who was extremely helpful. And he got a call from Bernard while Bernard was on the run. And Brian had lent him $50 before the robbery, and Bernard said he was going to send him 100, and Brian said, well, you only owe me 50. But anyways, he got off the phone, and he mentioned to some friends that he'd had a call, and it wasn't long before he was being interrogated by, I think, a couple of U.S. Marshals. But I
Yeah.
don't believe the FBI ever went back.
yeah. Out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And even though it was a big robbery by Maine standards, I started working for the IRS in '72, and I think at that point in time, drug investigations were a higher priority. And so if they were a higher priority, that meant that promotion opportunities would be to do drug investigations in Boston, not bank robberies in Mars Hill.
Yes, and that amount of money wasn't a big bank robbery.
Not by Boston standards,
No,
by
no.
Maine standards, it's still the
Yeah.
largest bank robbery in state of Maine history, but by Boston standards,
Yeah.
it's not.
No, most people wouldn't go to the bank to withdraw that much money in Boston. Then it's about robbery. It's a fantastic book. It
Thank
really
you.
is, Ron, and well-written, and I'll look forward to your next writing, and I'm sure that there's going to be more in the future.
I have things in mind. After I wrote the Mountain Guidebook, I submitted several book proposals to publishers, and we had some fairly serious discussions, but we never got to the point where a contract was signed. But one of the books that I'm very interested in writing is what I would call a Catch-22 style book about life in the IRS.
Oh, wow.
And
Yeah.
I think people would be interested to read about what really happens in the IRS.
Yes.
At least from my perspective, and
Yeah.
I was on the front lines for over 30 years.
Yeah,
So I'd like very much to write that book, because I think it's a story worth telling and that people would like to hear.
yeah.
And I've come close to getting a couple of contracts with it, and I'm hopeful that this book will, with some relative success, will be a vehicle for finding a publisher
Right.
for the IRS book. And in fact, I've gotten three chapters written, and I'm working on the fourth. And one of my goals this winter is to start marketing that book idea. So
Yeah,
I think that's one book that I definitely like to write. A couple of others that I have in mind, because I grew up in Gardner, and in the late '60s there were two people who were murdered who I was close to, and I don't think justice was served in either case. And I'd like to write one book with a parallel story, because they're about the same ages when they died, and
wow.
research not only their very interesting lives, but their murder and what
Transpired since.
transpired, and maybe get closer to the real truth as opposed to what the justice system found. And another book that very much, excuse me, interests me is, I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it, but I do a little bit of sea kayaking, and there's an island in eastern Casco Bay called Malaga Island. And it was the site of a multiracial community, basically squatters in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And they were forcibly evacuated by the state of Maine in the early 1900s, and many of them were sent to Pineland, which was essentially a mental asylum back then.
Right.
And others were sort of just left out, living in like houseboats and things like that. I think it's a very interesting story, and I'd love to research it and write about it. The one thing that concerns me about that story is that I'm not sure how much information you could actually get, because they didn't have a school there, they didn't have a library, they didn't have, and because when they were forcibly evacuated, they literally even tore up the foundations of the buildings, and they disinterred the bodies from the graveyard. So it'd be difficult to find the information, but I'd still like to research that story.
That sounds like a fantastic book in the workings for that. And I commend you again for the great Mars Hill Bank robbery.
Thank you very
book.
much.
It's a fine piece of work, and encourage people that are going to see this show to go out and buy the book, because you really, really will enjoy it. Thank you, Ron.
Yep, thank you.
So much.
Nice to meet you.
Appreciate
Yep.
it. And that's it for this time on Kennebec Valley Forum. We'll see you next time.
Are you thinking of buying, selling, or investing in real estate, but you don't know where to start? Have you searched for a realtor who will be nearby when they are needed, who will answer your calls and emails, who will go the extra mile to ensure your every need is met, who will help you with sourcing and supplying contractors while negotiating the best deal possible? Do you need a realtor who does not believe in high-pressure sales tactics or other gimmicks? Then you need me. My name is Steve Roy, and I offer a full-service professional sales and customized marketing package for my clients. I am helping clients with buying, selling, and investing. I will build a custom plan to fit your needs. I will work closely with you to ensure that you achieve your goals. My services include not only an analysis of your local market and correct pricing, but I will also help you to prepare your home for sale and make it look as desirable as possible to buyers by providing expert advice, using professional quality photographs, and compelling descriptions. Let me help you minimize cost and maximize your profits. Call me today, 207-649-8522.
The Village Market, located at 95 Main Street, Fairfield, is your small-town, fully stocked grocery store with that big store feel. Carrying quality vegetables, fruits, meats, deli items, and sure-fine products. They even have some inviting desserts. On your lunch break, stop by and grab one of the prepared, ready-to-go meals. Village Market's knowledgeable and courteous staff makes your visit an enjoyable experience. Visit them on Facebook and online at villagemarketfairfield.com. Open 7 days a week, the Village Market. We've got your groceries and more.